Good evening, and welcome to our panel discussion this evening on intercultural competence and quality teaching. I want to welcome you all to the Global Virtual Exchange Summit 2024, sponsored by the Hong Kong Baptist University. And this has been an exciting bunch of sessions so far, and we just listened to Dr. Dorner, and now we have an excellent panel before us to bring their papers and their ideas forward. I'm going to basically get into the session because, of course, you're well aware that we're time limited. And each, we've got 4 different papers to present. I will start the paper presentation, and then I will introduce each of the paper presentations that follow subsequently. Let's get started then. I will present my paper. I'm going to share my screen. We're good? Maggie, we're good? Excellent. I'm Professor Cheryl Loadman from the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, and I'm going to be discussing transforming design and implementation of COIL to unlock deeper learning, and which a topic which Dr. Dorner was just speaking about. Of course, we all know that COIL is the answer to our problems. We're all engaged. We're all doing it. We know that it's a great way to connect our students. It's enhancing classroom experiences. It's using technology in endless varieties that excite the students. And research is saying that it creates successful and valuable lessons for our students, valuable opportunities, valuable learning students. And everyone's doing it. There's not too many universities anymore that aren't doing it, although I must say that there are some that still aren't engaging fully, as our keynote speaker yesterday spoke to. We also see that research says there are lots of benefits, and having been a COILer myself, I can attest to those benefits. Of course, interpersonal global skills development, knowledge development and adherence, cognitive skill development. So these are clearly coming out in the research as benefits of COIL. And as the side benefits in the green little circles there are faculty growth and the ripple effect on our institutions, accessibility, which has really expanded because no longer do students need to travel internationally. They just connect via Zoom, and it's cost effective for our institutions. The research also identifies there's challenges, and anybody who's done COIL will be sensitive to these kinds of challenges. I'm not going to go through the list because, again, we all know them, but just to highlight some of the key ones, that extra time and work required is always an element. Our institutions haven't quite bought in fully to the COIL model, and we're not getting the financial support, maybe the dedicated assistance support. Navigating time zones, languages. So these are the typical kinds of issues that are coming up in the research, and I can attest to them. Again, having done the COILs that I have, these are real challenges and ones that I think we're going to be able to surmount as COIL becomes much more embedded in our institutions. So that is a typical COIL model perfection, and this is what I've come to understand, and Dr. Dorner referred to the tech model, or technological du Monterey model. It's one that I've seen repeated in other COILs: the icebreaker, the collaboration experience, team building discussions, the second collaboration, group work, problem solving, and then a reflection or self-evaluation. It really is the frame I'm seeing across the institutions that I'm dealing with. We typically see some variations on that. It might be the project is longer, that the matches have one or more institutions, usually 2, sometimes 3, not often more than that. In fact, I don't think I've seen one with 4 or even more than that. And we know that the guiding supports are important. And again, research is showing, we need to be sensitive to training our students in advance of the COIL experience, that helps them build a better connection, a better interaction, a better intellectual experience, and a better takeaway. And I'm not going to go through those, but they're established in research. What we don't talk about is the limitations of COIL, or we don't talk about how those limitations impact COIL. And the questions that I've been asking and have sort of driven me into some other interesting areas are we capturing the deepest learning? Can our students achieve more in their COIL experience? Are we really exposing them to everything that COIL can give them? Are they developing the best range of skills in the COIL experience? Are we challenging them as fully as we can? And are we just simply repeating the process? And that's a bit of a concern for me now that I've become quite a COILer, and you'll see what my record is very quickly here in terms of the COIL. But I'm beginning to feel that I just do the same thing, the same sort of process, the four-step process over and over again. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best way to manage the COIL experience. So I asked myself, do we need more innovation to capture more and respond to the students' evolving needs in the COIL? What my concern being, and when I started the discussions with Dr. Dorner, which she alluded to in her presentation, was what happens when we start getting students who are doing COIL in every class? Does it become just another experience in the classroom for them? Are they going to find it a boring experience because it's the same experience they did in the other class and now we're doing it again? Particularly if all they're learning is the same sort of skill set, the cultural nuances are overlaid by knowledge adherence and those typical other elements. So that was a real concern that drove my research around these innovation needs of COIL. So my experience is this. I've worked with COIL for 4 years. I'm starting my 4th year, and 3 of those years were with Technological de Monterrey, a very, very productive experience. And I've had an estimated 600 students through the COIL process, and that's a lot of students. I got to admit, that's a lot of students from my university as well as the other partner universities that I've worked with. And one of the challenges I started to find is my classes are quite big. I have a number of sections of students that I put into the COIL during a semester, ranging in the numbers of 100 to 120 students. So when I'm looking for a COIL partner, I need a COIL partner that can deliver lots of opportunity, or else I'm stacking my students up against their students, and that's not a productive experience in my view for the Canadian student, who I have various views that my students need to be in a position where they're either equal to or less than the partnered institution for a variety of reasons, but that's one of the processes that I adhere to. So what happened in my last year, and it's continuing into this year, was I decided to try something different. I had a classroom of over 100 students, but 100 students who participated. And I decided to try and get as many COILs as I could from different universities, basically in stacking them into those 100 students. So I ended up with in one classroom of 100 students, actually it's 2 classrooms or 2 sections, but I just combined them. And when you go virtual, you can actually combine across. You don't need to have walls called classrooms or student groups. You can just have a COIL. And so I had a COIL with 100 students in it. I stacked inside of that COIL, or inside of my 100 students, 5 distinct COIL collaborations, all set within the same time frame, although not all COILs were the same length, but over a 6-week period. They all had different projects, they had different deliverables and different outcomes. And so this was a really, really unique experience for my students, and as well, I think in terms of what I'm seeing out in the COIL world, this doesn't happen very often or even at all. One of the key elements of the experience is that every class, we meet twice a week, the students debrief for 25 minutes. So we went around and talked about our COIL experience. How is your COIL doing? What are you learning? What are you challenged by? What excites you about the COIL? And that's what we did every class. And so this is the universities and the countries that they experienced. There was Ukraine, which brought a very unique COIL experience for my students. Of course, they're in a state of war right now. They did a country assessment project, HBKU, and I want to just shout out to the Hong Kong Baptist University, because they've Hong Kong Baptist University. Sorry, I've got your acronym wrong there. I was able to get 2 projects with them, a market entry and an HR project. The University of Los Angeles in Colombia, where we did a negotiation project, and Tec de Monterrey in Mexico. And we did a complex market assessment project. And so with the students in that classroom, across those 2 classrooms, got to experience 4 different countries, although 2 and 5 different projects. And they every week or every class, they debriefed on them. And you can see the matching that we did in that classroom. Most of the time it was 1-to-1, 1-to-2, or 2-to-2. 2-to-2 experience for my Canadian students. So the 1 Canadian to 2 or 2 Canadians to 2. What ended up showing up was that, as expected, my students reported, as they do in every COIL, whether it was the 3 years with Tech de Monterrey, that they loved the experience. It was exciting. They learned a lot of cultural issues, or learned a lot about culture rather. They learned about business issues. They saw how their cultures did business. They got to practice real skills in real experiential learning situations. Positive research. It validated what research is telling us, that COIL works, and it does so well. But they also reported a number of novel results. Because they were learning, debriefing every class for 25 minutes, sometimes 30, depending on how exciting the topic was. They reported that they learned about the other cultures that they were hearing about. So they would talk about their project with country X, and then they would hear about the experience of students with country Y, and they would actually talk to each other about, well, why was that the case? Why is your experience different than my experience? It increased the cultural learnings. They come out of the class saying, not only did I understand my country's culture, but I learned about another country's culture, and I got to compare them on a student-to-student peer level. They also learned about business in other countries, and that was another observation they made, is that because the projects were different, but they were still tried to approximate a real experience, they felt that they had a good understanding, because of the debriefing, because of the discussions, of other countries' business, even though it wasn't the country they were looking at. What I was most amazed by was how they began to think critically, ask really thoughtful questions about another student's comments and their experiences. So they would ask the deeper why. How did that happen? Why did it happen? And then they would compare it to their own in a reflective manner. Again, amazing to me, because I'd never seen it at the level that I was seeing it at through the COILs I'd been in previously. There were serendipitous outcomes as well. They were excited by the experience. They enjoyed the conversations. They were very, in fact, when the days that I said to them, I think we're going to have to cut the debrief short, they actually told me I should not talk about the other stuff in the class, but rather they wanted to do the debrief because they felt they were learning so much more. They also talked about their frustrations, and of course, students don't tell each other openly about frustrations, but when they started saying, well, working with this group of students was a bit challenging, their educational expectations are different, they began to talk about why those expectations were different, and how they could work through it as business people in the future. So overall, the novel results of this experience were amazing, and in fact, so much so that I'm repeating it this term, and I've got a similar set of countries, except I've removed one and added another one. Brazil will be coming on to this stream, and hopefully maybe a European country. I might try 6 in the classroom, depending on how many students I have. We haven't started our semester yet. You're probably wondering, how is it possible to do all of that? I'm going to talk about that in a second here. Well, actually, I'll talk about it now. So I don't have a slide on the challenges of all of this crazy coiling that's happening in my classroom. But surprisingly, I have one TA that helps me, teaching assistant that helps me. And the amazing thing is because we've got the COILs down to a science, we do the same thing every time. It's pretty easy to implement that many COILs across the classrooms. The students see it as a seamless experience, even though it's a different iteration of experiences. But they're all doing a COIL. They all have a 4-week time frame. They all have deliverables. And the LMS I use, or learning management system, allows me to set up specific sections. Hong Kong here, Mexico here. Please go to your section after you've been assigned that section, not unlike an assignment they would do on an individual or a group basis. So that wasn't the issue. I think the bigger issue was working with 5 different sets of professors. That was an interesting experience because some of the professors were brand new. The Ukrainian professor was going through very difficult situations that we had to constantly navigate. So that was an anomaly, but we did have to navigate some of those issues. So some of these professors were new. Some of them had been doing COIL with me for a while, and we just repeated the COIL. In fact, because we'd been working together so effectively for a while, two of them were repeats. It was just like plug and play. We just plugged it in and it played itself, and it was great. So I think that it is a bit of more, it would be a bit more work, and I can do it without a teaching assistant, I believe, but it does require a bit more work. But I have to say the results of the student experience and their feedback actually says that this is the way that I would continue to do it, is look for other COILs, particularly because it does allow my students to have an individual basis. If I'm stacking up classrooms against a 50 student base to 100, it's 2-to-1 Canadians. And I much prefer to have a different ratio of 1-to-1 or two foreign students to 1 Canadian student. So that's an important observation. The next steps for this. So it was sort of a incidental experience that I ended up in a 5 COIL model, but I plan to test, actually start to construct it as a research project, and more structured, more questions to ask, so that I can test out whether this is in fact a way to create more innovations inside the COIL experience, to draw more learnings out. My students came away having knowledge about 5 cultures, and in a reflective way. They learned about it through conversation with their peers, and that's a very positive. And they came away understanding international business at a different level than they would have had they just done 1 COIL. I need to figure out the questions to ask the students to measure the effectiveness of it. One of the observations that Dr. Dorner and I have made is that we always ask these questions, pre-COIL, post-COIL questions that give us the same results, largely because the students have no comparison between their COIL experiences. In this case, they did. They got to compare COILs. And in some cases, one student, I think it was just one, but one wrote a really big essay on this. He said, I am so glad that I was with this country, X, because that country Y was really, really challenging. And I'm glad that I got to hear about that challenging so I could know what it was going to come. But my country was really different. In fact, it was really easy. And that's not a typical response. They would always say, oh, it's so hard. It's like, this was a difficult challenge, until they heard what that other country's student COIL experience was. So I need to figure out a question set that will give me better measurables for research purposes. And I need to identify extraneous variables that might be impacting the outcomes of their experiences. You know, maybe I just had the best class in the world. They were amenable to this kind of process. So, the next class might hate it. The last thing is, I won't go through the theoretical foundations. I always love to talk about theory, but I'm not going to do that tonight. It's late, it's 10 o'clock at night here in Canada. But I also want to connect, of course, various theories to this, as we do as academics, and that will be part of the research that comes out of this. Right now, it's just an abstract that talks about what I've discovered in a qualitative way. It's to some degree quantitative because of the surveys. But again, I'd like to do a more in-depth research work with Dr. Dorn, and I will probably do it together to see if this is something that we can model for future COIL iterations or future COIL experiences. That's all I have. I have a reference list, but if you're interested beyond the questions that you're going to ask today, I'm more than happy to answer any emails that you may have. That's my time. And I'm getting the thumbs up from Maggie, which means that I probably was within my 15 minutes. And so with that, I would like to introduce the next speaker in this session. That is Dr. Davies from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So welcome, Dr. Davies. And Dr. Davies is going to speak on, just one sec. I'm just scrolling down here. Sorry, Doctor. Exploring sociocultural competencies via virtual international exchange. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Davies.
Thank you. Can you please unshare your slides, please?
I will do that right now. There you go.
All right, okay. Okay, let me put it in the 1 second. Can you see my PowerPoints? Yes or no?
Maggie says yes. So go ahead, Dr.
Okay,
Maggie.
great. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Considering the time, I am straight entering into the concept, like Professor Loadman mentioned, my COIL experience is totally different. I am an associate professor at the School of Nursing, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. For this COIL experience, I partnered with the University of de Monterrey, Mexico, with the Department of Psychology. So as she mentioned, the purpose of the COIL is international collaboration between two different universities takes place via a virtual platform, and the major goal is to promote intercultural competence. So here in my case, so I teach undergraduate honors program, and we partnered with the Department of Psychology students from Department of Psychology, University of de Monterrey, Mexico, where they were pursuing quantitative research course. So the common course or the element what we focus is the research. So my students were actually in the application form of their research with their honors project, whereas the UDM students, they were pursuing their quantitative research. So we focus the common element of research and connected with the cultural aspect as well as the social structure and healthcare differences between two countries, and promoted the intercultural activities via this COIL platform. So our COIL program was for 5 weeks of duration. This was my first COIL experience, the presentation is based on my first COIL experience last year. I just started by my second year of COIL experience as of last week. So last year I started late in the course from October 12th to November 16th. We used the virtual platforms including Zoom for the synchronized meeting, and other asynchronous sessions were via Canvas, Padlet, and email communications. Then I received a COIL grant from my Global Health Office. With that grant, I partnered with the UDM professor, and we collaboratively designed the COIL syllabus for the program, and we paired the student groups. Like Professor Loadman said, we try to have a 1:1 match for most of the student groups. Up to 27 student groups, we did have 1:1 match. And for the 4 student groups, we had to share one student from UDM, because I had 40 honor students in my class, and UDM students, they were only 31. So last 4 groups, we had to share one student. Then I created a COIL Canvas site dedicated for this COIL program. And I added or gave access to the faculty and the students from UDM as well as my own students. And I embedded the Padlet within the Canvas site. So therefore, all the modules were set up from week 1 to week 5. And so, it was well structured and organized. Students didn't have any issue to identify their course content or activities. Now, in summary, similar to what Professor Loadman said, we started with an introductory activity. So my introductory activity was to ask the students to write a 1-page letter and send it to their partner via email. So I was very particular that in the introductory letter, the focus is to write about what they know or what they heard about the other country. For example, for my students, it's about the Mexico. Then the second meeting or the intercultural activity via Zoom, the student groups met via Zoom. We created breakout rooms and paired them via breakout rooms. And the focus was to address about the cultural differences between the countries and how those cultural differences can be applied to the research. Then my students presented their proposed honors project to the UDM students, and they discussed, how they perceive these projects within their country, within their social structure. Then via Canvas, I uploaded my recorded lectures, and the UDM professor uploaded the documents for my students to read based on the social structure of Mexico as well as the healthcare structure of the Mexico. Then for our second face-to-face Zoom meeting, the students met again via Zoom, and they discussed about their collaborative project. Since our course was focused on the research, we made it we made sure that our project was focused more on the cultural elements of the research as well as the organizational, ethical, as well as differences related to social structure, how they were applied to the research world. So like Professor Loadman mentioned, we really applied a theoretical framework into our project, which was adapted framework for cross-cultural engagement. So this is an adapted framework. I only adapted 9 domains out of the framework. Those were applicable to our COIL objectives. As you can see, starting from cultural heritage to approaches to conflict. So after obtaining the formal IRB approval, I officially evaluated the COIL program. So I created 18 Likert type questions focused on cultural competencies related to the cultural context of the research. So these questions were paired questions, like 9 questions evaluated students' perception about the cultural competencies before the COIL program, and the same question repeated after the COIL program. And I also added 2 open text questions. Plus, using the framework, I did the deductive content analysis of the Padlet reflections. So for each student activity, besides debriefing in the class, I let the students to do Padlet reflections. So I downloaded the Padlet. Using the framework, I did a formal qualitative deductive content analysis. So our quantitative survey results, out of the 71 students, 49 responded, and there was a clear shift from in their cultural competencies from less experience and low confidence to more experience and positive confidence after the COIL. So these are some of the examples. You can see the first graph indicates before COIL experience. Second one indicates their experience after COIL for each of the corresponding questions. So for the Padlet reflections, as well as the 2 open text analysis, me and my COIL TA, we read the reflections many times, and we coded the reflections using the domains of the adapted framework for cross-cultural engagement, and see how their reflection matched with the 9 domains of the adapted framework for cross-cultural engagement. So interestingly, all the 9 domains we picked from the framework matched well with the reflections. And among these 9 domains, value orientation were the most commonly repeated domain of the adapted framework, followed by worldviews and myths and stories. So the cultural competencies we identified through the deductive content analysis include like a cultural heritage. Students reflected about the importance of family and meals as core values of Mexican culture, whereas the students from Mexico reported about their strong sense of individualism and the personal freedom in US. And the cultural rituals, the discussion was more focused about the celebrations in United States and Mexico. So the religious,
you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So the religious and spiritual practices, they spoke about the dominant religion in each countries and health practices. That was a very rich reflection about the healthcare structure differences. Like United States is more like a private structure, whereas in Mexican culture, there is more both government as well as the private sector. So in addition to that, they also discussed some common stuff they identified in the health practices, like lack of accessible healthcare in certain groups, the stigma related to the mental health treatment in both countries, etc. So worldviews, so there was rich discussion about the individualistic nature of the Americans, and interestingly, my students were unaware that the UDM was a top university in Mexico, and there was a rich discussion about the sporting practices in both countries. So value orientation, this was very interesting. Reflected the fact that there was a bonding experience they developed through this COIL collaboration, which promoted cross-cultural appreciation, and they are so reflected about the need for culturally and ethically responsible research. And they shared many myths and stories related to the geographical landscape between US and the Mexico, as well as rich discussion about the research fabrication. So in relation to the last domain, approaches to conflict, they all acknowledge the fact that engaging in a culturally responsive research is needed to explore or to address the health disparities and to have a broader understanding of the complex health issues. So these are some of the exemplar quotes I picked up from the Padlet reflection based on the deductive content analysis, matching with each of the domains of the adapted framework.
I'm sorry, you're done? Oh,
Yes.
no, there we go. Okay. There's one more slide. That's why I was waiting.
Yeah, so basically, this is some more like a summary slide similar to you presented, Dr. Loadman. So definitely there was a shift in experience and confidence in cultural competencies based on the research context, because our course was focused on the research and feasibility of COIL as a virtual opportunity and cost-effective path for international learning. And more importantly, in my institution, most of the matching courses were done with a nursing course from different country. And I was the first person who tried with matching a nursing course with the other disciplines. So it was helpful to see that interdisciplinary collaboration and participation.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. I learned a lot from it. So we'll move on to our next set of speakers, and that would be Dr. Cartwright from Portland State University, Dr. Lau from Hong Kong Baptist University, and Dr. Emma Zhang from Hong Kong Baptist University as well. They will be discussing their paper, Employing an Assessment to Develop Practices in Virtual Exchange, Turning Challenges into Opportunities. Doctors.
Emma, are you first? Dr. Zhang?
Thank you, Chris. I didn't realize that my microphone was on mute. So can everybody see our slide? Yeah, okay. Great. Thank you very much for joining our presentation. So our presentation will focus on 2 case studies of COIL practices, and we will talk about the role of assessment, using assessment to create opportunities for student and staff development. So Chris.
Yes, thank you so much. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's evening here on the west coast of the US. I'm Chris Cartwright, and I'm thrilled to be here with you. Today, we're going to talk about the practice of assessment of intercultural competences and what that plays in the development of this work. We will highlight the tendency of some learners to overestimate their competencies early in a program of study, and that's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. And then we'll discuss case studies from both China and the US using assessment practices and present. And throughout these, we're using a single intercultural assessment tool called the Intercultural Effectiveness Scale, as well as others. And it's effective in this process. Next slide, please. Actually, skip to slide 3, go to number 4. So in my experience in working with learners in any context, but certainly with COIL, which is such a tightly designed instructional process, there are 2 questions that each instructor needs to think about as they get started. How do you know they know? What evidence will come to you that learning has taken place? And equally as important, how do they know they know? What has been revealed to them that is new, and can they truly grasp it, reflect on it, and understand it? Those 2 questions determine what we're doing. Next slide, please. When assessing anything, but particularly with intercultural competence, we have to look at the individual, the training, the course, and the outcomes. And it's important that we zero in at the end and do backwards instructional design and focus on what is the profile of the competent graduate of our learning experience. What is that supposed to look like? And then build carefully to make sure that the elements of that learning and the ability to recognize them for you, the instructor, and they, the learner, will be present at the end. Next slide. There are 4 types of assessment that I think are important when you practice assessment as part of your assessment to development practice. Assessment of learning, that's where instructors can see that the learners have mastered the subject matter, whatever it is. There's assessment as learning, which provides the learner with an opportunity to create learning in its own right by acting in building blocks of metacognition on their development. There's formative assessments. These are assessments that are in the process of giving personal feedback and help the learners engage and better understand their own awareness and capacities. And finally, there are summative assessments that are done at the end of a learning process or course to help you and them recognize what has been achieved. Next slide. The Dunning-Kruger effect is this sometimes situation where the learner overestimates. It's a cognitive bias where they overestimate their capacity early in a learning experience. It tends to occur when there's a lack of self-awareness and they're not able to accurately assess their own skills. Next slide. I found this graphic on a business page, and in the early stages where there's very low competence but high confidence, they think they already know it. And then throughout the curve, they become more aware of the complexity of the situation, particularly intercultural learning, and become more competent, but stop overestimating it. So this is what's happened. But the practice of doing your assessment work so you can witness this is complex, and we'll get to that. So now it's time for our case study from Hong Kong, and Dr. Lau and Zhang will explain it to you.
Great, thanks, Chris. This is Sam from Hong Kong Baptist University, also part of the Virtual Exchange Center. So the first case study was about a COIL running between 3 universities and in 3 cities, 2 in China, 1 in the States. And we have around 300 students and covering 3 different courses. But we found a common ground that we focus on the context on environmental change, in particular climate change. So next slide, please. So the COIL lasts for 8 weeks, and we aim to form a smaller groups. So roughly 8 to 9. So you can imagine we have over 30 groups. It was quite a challenge to manage to support the student groups. And we aim to, for each meetings, and which should last at least 20 minutes, and that should be at least 4 meetings over the 8-week period. So students are expected to meet, discuss, exchange, and post their meeting reflection and screenshot right after each meeting on the platform top hat. Next slide, please. So what did they do? So they were instructed to discuss the problems of climate change, in particular on the effect of climate change. How did they affect our day-to-day living and lifestyle in the 3 respective cities? And then the effect of climate change on our health and well-being, and also the change that they need to make to turn the tide of climate change. And in terms of data collection, so we do collect the data via survey, feedback form, and also interview amongst our students. So let me pass the time to Emma to talk about the result.
Thank you, Dr. Lau. So when we pair together 120 participants, pre and post assessment scores, we found that we can see some development in intercultural engagement, world orientation, as well as relationship development. So we do have positive and statistically significant results when we combine the 3 groups. However, if we look at data from separate groups, for example, this is a result from our 50 participants from the United States, we cannot claim any statistically significant improvements in any of the areas that we were measuring. And we come across an even more troubling result when we confront the results we get from the mainland participants. We actually found that their hardiness and positive regard had decreased, and this decrease was statistically significant. So as facilitators, we need to make sense of these results. How did we get a positive overall result? We find much of that improvement actually happened in the 41 Hong Kong group. So these students actually made statistically significant improvements in the 3 areas that I mentioned previously, as well as their overall intercultural effectiveness score. So when we asked our students what are their experiences, and we can identify 3 major challenges, which is common among all virtual exchange programs, that is a time zone difference, language barrier, as well as student absence. So why did these challenges affect our students, 3 groups of students so differently? That's the question we need to ask and understand. From the more specific student feedback, we found that the Hong Kong students, because of the language education policy that we have here, which is bilingual, triliterate, trilingual, biliterate, the Hong Kong group actually had access to Mandarin, English, as well as Cantonese, so they did not experience language barriers the same way the other 2 groups of students experienced. So this contributed to a group dynamic where the Hong Kong group was uniquely empowered, whereas the US and mainland group were disempowered because of the linguistic barrier. And this may have contributed to students' reluctance to engage in these synchronous interactions. Again, from student feedback, we find that reluctant students to engage in the experience tend to be students from US or mainland China, whereas from the feedback we get from Hong Kong students, the language difficulty or the challenges that they faced in the beginning became a motivation for them to learn and eventually draw positive growth from. So then, as educators, we need to think about ways to empower the empower the students in the exchange. We need to be aware of linguistic, the power dynamic, linguistic differences and capabilities created in these intergroup interactions. So just providing the platform is not enough to assist the student growth. So before I discuss how we may deal with these learner differences, I would invite Chris to talk about his experience in the US.
Thank you, Sam and Emma.
So
my case,
Chris, you have about 3 minutes.
okay, I'll be very quick. So my case study is actually of a study abroad with global and transfer programs. So it was not a VE program, but it was a rich one for which we did it for over 3 years and learned a lot through the process. Next slide. We had multiple options for the students to take on. They were overseas in Asia, in Europe, Central and South America, and 2 that were considered global. So they were in Portland, Oregon, where we're from, but they were engaging internationally. Next slide. We had a very tight intentional instructional design with pre-work, assessment work, time abroad, an actual shift happened in year 3 that I'll describe in a minute, and then post-work and a post-session. Next slide. We used the Intercultural Effectiveness Scale. We used a written qualitative assignment that we scored with the AAC&U Intercultural rubric, and then they had 2 post-course assignments that they could choose from depending on where they were going that we used to bring the learning together. Next slide. What we found was that across the board over the 3 years, we always had 10% of our learners who were not growing. They were reversing from the quantitative data, and that was annoying. So we did a redesign in year 3, and we're looking at the evidence. It just wasn't clear, but there was something about deep reflection on reframing. So we introduced an assignment that caused them to reframe challenges that they came upon the way, and then went back again. And even though we had the same 10% reverse scores, we had 100% evidence through the qualitative data that the students had learned to reframe their intercultural challenges and therefore were growing. And that was the point of this exercise. Next slide. Throughout our work, we try to use the instructional design process to make sure the group is as deep as better. This is a summary of our statistics. And in year 2017 and 2018, the overall score was a 5.6 and a 5.5. But in the year 3, the overall score was a 10.8. And this is the summary of all 3 years. All these statistics are statistically significant. So we were able to make growth, but in fact, improve growth greatly by intentionally bringing in critical self-reflection when they reach cultural problems. Emma, back to you.
Thank you, Chris. Just very quickly, we need to reflect on the comparison between the 2 courses. We find that a longer course will allow both learners and educators to adjust their strategies. From the point of view of educators, we need to create a third place, a third space where differences are welcomed and celebrated and not perceived as a barrier. And we need to provide both synchronous and asynchronous opportunities for communication so that disempowered learners can use methods to focus on tasks and use maybe auto translation to help them communicate better. Then as facilitators, we need to give students support both before, during, and after their exchange, like Professor Loadman has suggested. So based on this, as administrators, we should not simply look at statistical data to decide upon the effectiveness of virtual exchange. Instead, we need to use that data as informative and give us a starting point about how to go about to support our students, especially empower those disempowered learners. Thank you. That's all.
Excellent. That was a great presentation. Thank you. Very interesting. I have questions, but I'll wait. So thank you very much, Doctors Cartwright, Zhang, and Lau. We're going to move on to the next presentation, and that is Dr. Lau and Dr. Li, both doctors from the Hong Kong Baptist University. And they are going to be talking about enhancing intercultural effectiveness among business students, the role of team commitment in virtual exchange.
Yeah,
You're up.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Connie, a senior lecturer in marketing. And with me today is Dr. Sam Lau again, our Director of Research Math and Management Office. We both represent School of Continuing Education and Hong Kong Baptist University. We are glad to share with you our research enhancing intercultural effectiveness among business students, the role of team commitment and virtual exchange. We are going to walk you through why we did this research, the literature review on the intercultural effectiveness and team commitment, the method that we use for data collection, and we will also review our findings along with its implications and research limitations. As many of you may agree, in the business world, we need to equip students with intercultural competence. Intercultural competence is an essential skill for business students. For example, during our classes, we prepared them to collaborate and interact with students from diverse backgrounds. And when they graduate, we hope that they will be able to communicate effectively with colleagues and potential business clients from diverse cultural backgrounds. Traditionally, we developed students' cultural competence through physical exchanges. And now with virtual exchanges becomes more popular, we find that virtual exchange can solve some of the challenges related to physical exchange, such as financial barriers, psychological factors, such as separation from family, travel anxiety, and cultural shock. And with the pandemic that happened in previous year, we know that our education framework could be vulnerable. And we must think out of the box and consider how we equip students with the same skills, but in a virtual format. So here comes to our literature and objectives. When we look into the literature of intercultural effectiveness, several studies have already demonstrated that intercultural effectiveness could be enhanced through virtual exchange. And in the past, researchers usually used pre and post research to look at the improvements of intercultural effectiveness. But these studies do not include control groups. So we believe that additional research is required to confirm the relationship and also the enhancement of IE are due to the FEE programs being implemented. And if we look at the definition of intercultural effectiveness, it is the behavioral skill set that students have in when they communicate in diverse cultural interaction. It is one of the dimensions under intercultural competence. And when we look at the definition of intercultural competence, it also includes intercultural awareness, which emphasizes on knowledge and understanding of one's own and other cultures. And another dimension is intercultural sensitivities, which talks about a person's feeling, how we feel towards others' behavior. and whether we could show effective respect for different cultural behaviors, perceptions, and emotions. And in our research, particularly, we choose IE, intercultural effectiveness. It is because we really want to capture students' behavioral skills in during the virtual exchange program that they involved in. We also identified team satisfaction and commitment as the mediator of this research. For example, team satisfaction, we study to what extent students feel happy when working with their teammates overseas. And for team commitment, it's about the degree to which they attach to the team, not only with the team in their home country, but also the teammates from their overseas counterparts. How do we measure this? For example, we try to examine their willingness to accept personal responsibility, and when making decisions, whether they will put the team's interest first. So to sum up, our research objectives are based on two elements. So first of all, in our research, we incorporate a control group trying to investigate the effectiveness of VE in enhancing cultural effectiveness. The second research objective is that we assess the mediating role of team dynamics, including team satisfaction and team commitment on the development of intercultural effectiveness within VE. So now I will pass the time to Dr. Sam Lau to elaborate more on the research design and findings.
Great, thank you, Connie. So this is Sam, and as Connie mentioned, we do have a treatment group and also the control group. Regarding the treatment group, we have students coming from Hong Kong and also from the state. They are specializing in marketing, and they would form teams, up to 7 teams, and with US students and Hong Kong students. And then they would exchange, pair up, and do the collaboration. So they were instructed in particular to do the exchange, and they got to learn from each other, suggest alternative, provide feedback, and also answer advice from their peers from other countries. And regarding for the control group, we had a student coming from business background also, and so they are comparable to the Hong Kong student doing the treatment group. And the student, both treatment and control groups, and they were instructed to fill an online questionnaire focusing on team commitment, team satisfaction, and intercultural effectiveness. So let's take a look at the sample questions of the 3 instruments. Say, for example, for team satisfaction, they were asked whether they're happy or not happy on the team. And in terms of team commitment, they will be asked, we accepted personal responsibility for the success, and team member put their personal interest before the interests of the team. So you will see R, they refer the reverse item. For the intercultural effectiveness, sample question like, able to alter my behavior to fit the culture they are in, and they feel confident while interacting with people coming from different countries or in cultures. So next slide, please. So when we take a look at the reliability based on the combat alpha, so we note that the alpha from the 3 scale were well above 0.7. So in terms of findings, firstly, let's take a look at the intercultural effectiveness, comparing between the virtual exchange group and the control group. And we'll see some significant finding here on this data table. So next slide, I'll show you the specific details. So compared to control group, the treatment group report a significantly higher level of intercultural effectiveness. In particular, so the student in the treatment group, they show greater interaction respect, message skills, identity maintenance. So later on, I will explain a bit more about these implications. In terms of mediation analysis, we note that team commitment actually partially mediates the relationship between virtual exchange and the intercultural effectiveness. So what do these findings mean to us? So the takeaway message is we do find similar result from other studies. So we do have a high level of intercultural effectiveness after joining the virtual exchange experience. And this really highlights how effective the virtual exchange is in fostering intercultural learning, especially for our business students. So in terms of enhanced capability in intercultural effectiveness, specifically going to 3 areas. Firstly, interaction respect. So students are more open to acknowledging and appreciating diverse viewpoints. And for the message skills, the students are more confident in the ability to convey thoughts, ideas through verbal, non-verbal communication while interacting with peers coming from different cultures. And finally, identity maintenance, students were more able to preserve their own cultural identity while engaging in cross-cultural exchanges.
Dr. Lau, you have about 3 minutes.
Sure. And finally, just a few more slides. And so team commitment and serve as a partial mediator in the relationship between virtual exchange and intercultural effectiveness. So here really highlights the critical role of cultivating team commitment within our virtual exchange program so as to enhance the intercultural effectiveness. So finally, so the limitation, and here we rely on self-report data, of course, that implies social disability bias, and also the cultural orientation of the participant. We only take into account a student from Hong Kong and the state. Great, thank you so much.
Excellent, thank you. That was a really great presentation. Very interesting. I want to thank the entire panel for an excellent set of presentations, and I'm going to invite the audience, our listening audience, to see if there's any questions. That I invite you to use the chat or to open up your mic and ask our guests any questions that you might have. I'm actually gonna, maybe I'll start out the questions. I'll just jump in here because I thought all of the presentations were fantastic and very much relevant to the kind of stuff that I'm thinking about when I'm dealing with my COIL projects. Maybe I'll open it up to this question. How much of our COIL studies are influenced by other factors that we can't account for? Like I was mentioning in my presentation, just had a great class. Maybe that's what it was. Or the technology didn't annoy them, and so they're reflecting on that. Or it's a bad month of weather in Canada. I don't know if you guys have the same problems. Maybe it gets too hot, it gets too cold here. Those types of things might influence, because I'm oftentimes curious, or I'm oftentimes concerned that we keep measuring the same thing over and over by asking them the same questions, but they have no comparisons. And that's what I was saying in mine, is they have no comparison to say, well, yes, that experience was better than the last experience, and now I'm glad that I took this. I learned more than I thought I had known before. And I like your comment, Dr. Cartwright, that students actually overestimate what they know and what they don't know. What do you folks think?
Well, I think this is Dr. Cartwright. I think context is always important. And so recognizing that the factors that you brought up do impact our learners and what they're learning and how they're experiencing the learning. But it's also a matter of, in your practice of assessing learning, making sure that you take into account those things. So how do they explain to you that the technology annoyed them? or that there was no air conditioning in the room where they had to work and they couldn't wait to leave because it was too hot. You see what I'm saying? So those types of things need to be considered and then looked at it. Like in my case, I had some students who went to China, to mainland China, and they were unaware or pretended to be unaware that there was going to be a different way to engage technology than they are accustomed to in the US, and were profoundly annoyed that they couldn't just Snapchat and video link and do everything that they were used to doing. And they just got very angry at everyone. And it was kind of like, no, we told you this. We were very clear about this. And they just made these really negative attitudes. And so we have to really think about those things, and they become part of your evidence portfolio at the other end. So help you interpret what you're looking for. Yeah, I would say context is important. Don't forget it.
Anyone
Yeah,
else?
I totally agree, Chris. So I just want to add, in our case, we carried out the virtual exchange in 2020, right? So part of the reason students became engaged from mainland China and the US was because the tension between the two countries were rising that year. So external factors impact virtual exchange, and as instructors, we need to not only focus on the content that we are facilitating, such as climate change, but we also need to make room to address what is actually happening around our students and give them tools to deal with this. So in fact, these tensions that's happening between the nations gives us more of a reason to enhance person-to-person connection. And we should have taken that opportunity to enable it instead of letting our students be affected by that and carry on those prejudices.
Exactly.
Is Dr. Davies gone? I think she's gone. I think we've lost one of our speakers. Sorry, I had a question for her. Well, then I'll ask my second question, although I had them lined up in my head. One of the observations I've made is it might not be the length of the COIL, it might not be the format that we use for COIL, but rather it's the content that is really what matters inside the COIL. If we can engage intellectually our students, we can have a 10-day COIL or we can have a 6-week COIL. That those variables are, and even the technology is just a tool. Really what they want and what they enjoy the most is that the challenges that we give them, and the more that they're challenged, the more everything else doesn't matter. What do you think of that one?
Yeah, I think I agree. Yeah, the content is actually the key to drive students to engage in the virtual exchange discussion. Yeah, from my experience, and when we discuss the content of the exchange with different instructors from, say, for my sample, for my presentation with Emma and Chris, that was a student from mainland China and also state. We actually running different course, but we came together to think of a common ground, so which is climate change. And I think the content got to be relevant to the students, to their course, and also to their daily life. And also the subject matter that should be interesting. So I think that would be the key to draw the student into engaging the discussion. On top of that, I think the virtual exchange, the exchange got to produce something that they got to bring in back to the assessment. That is important. Otherwise, they don't feel the need to really go in depth or go into the exchange to learn from their peers internationally. So once they learn something from their peers, they got to put into their own learning assessment. I think that would be another key point. Yeah, just some thoughts.
And I would add that, in growing intercultural competence in particular, the research has shown that the depth of the engagement, which the content is the catalyst for, is the primary instigator of growth. They grow when they reflect on what has happened and they make sense of it to themselves, but it's the depth of the engagement. So it's how are you facilitating that they are working across difference? If they're doing it alone at 3 in the morning in their pajamas, but they're not talking to the other people around the world, then it's really not being effective. But if the content really intrigues them and they reach out and deeply engage the people at the other end, they have to go, wow, I've never looked at it that way, or I'm going to reframe how I'm thinking about this, and that's new to me, whatever. That's the area of growth. That's the edge of growth. And so it's a matter of introducing them to the edge and encouraging them to step into their discomfort zone and really engage it. And so the content is the catalyst, but the engagement, the actual, I spoke to somebody in Hong Kong who I'd never spoke to before and learned something from them. That's where they're going to grow.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Yes. I'm gonna, although I think you all know each other, so I was gonna say, oh, you could maybe see if there's any questions amongst yourselves, but I think you all know each other. I'm the stranger here.
I'll ask you a question, Dr. Loadman. So yeah, I find your presentation very intriguing and impressive. How you carried out such a large scale virtual exchange with 5 different partners. I mean, I cannot even begin to imagine the workload and the complexity of the administrative support that you will need to facilitate that. So, right, my question is first, so what motivated you, right? The second, did you have any institutional support? If you did, of which kind, right? And third, I just want to compliment the fact that you give your students an opportunity to share with each other their exchange experience. And that's really eye-opening, important, and vital for students to have an experience sharing section so that they can compare notes, right? So that their self-assessment can become more informed. So I really love that practice. But what motivated you and what support do you have to carry out these long-term exchange?
I think that I would say I was motivated because I had 100 students. And as I said, one of the things I try to avoid is large groups, because in large groups, it's easy to get lost inside of the group and not really experience the culture. It's like, oh, the leads are talking and I can basically skate, coast through the project. So we really worked on one-to-one. That was a learning that Dr. Dorn and I had, was one-to-one was really good. Then it became a matter of making sure that the Canadian students, because we're as much as I think as much as Canadians are generous students, I think what I wanted to make sure was there was a power imbalance. I wanted that there to be 2 Mexicans and 1 Canadian, so that there was a power imbalance. That you could feel it when 2 Mexicans were chatting. They were chatting in Spanish, a new experience, right? Because if you're one-on-one, they'll speak English. If there's 2-on-1 or 3-on-1, they'll speak in their own language, particularly if there's so I wanted that power and balance. And so then it became a matter of I need to fill up this 100 student roster with, and then it became just accidental because I asked too many partners. I had such great response. I loved my partner faculty. And so I thought, well, I can make this work. I mean, I can make it work. So I was fortunate. I must say I was fortunate that I didn't have any crashes. I had a teaching assistant, did my grading, but I would have graded 100, I would have graded 100 anyway. The biggest issue was really the meetings with the faculty. The new faculty always take more time to develop a COIL. I was fortunate to have, of course, Hong Kong Baptist University. I had Yan, who I think is listening. She and I have had a two-year experience. So she was there, Tech was there. So really, I only had 3 new COILs that I had to deal with. So that was that, and they were good COILs. They were faculty who worked well with me and did. But another research paper I want to do is on faculty relationships, because that is so important in our COIL structure. But it goes beyond we like each other. It's can we work together? And what happens when after we get over the honeymoon, we actually get to meet the real person, and we don't get divorced. I make that analogy, and maybe it's an appropriate one. But so anyway, so I had very little institutional support. Now my institution does provide me with a teaching assistant, and so that does make a difference in terms of sometimes they would join me in meetings, take notes, make sure things got done. And when you work with tech, tech also provides, of course, full support. So I found supports as I could. I mean, I liked it so much, I'm doing it again. And I've got 6. We've got an interesting one. I've got 3 countries, a US and tech in Canada. So there's a 3-country COIL. So inside of this 6 COILs are going to be this, one with 3 countries. So it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out. It was the student responses that are driving me to do it again. I think as faculty, we've got to figure out the learning models of the new generation, and it's not lecturing anymore. It's giving them as much experience where they're learning from themselves experientially as we can.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, great job. I actually share Emma's views. Yeah, you did a very great job, Cheryl. Wow, very impressive.
Well, I do have Hong Kong Baptist University, Hong Kong Baptist was great because I had 2 from Hong Kong, and the great supports there through Anna. But just again, a shout out to them for having a great program there that made it easy for me. It's the institutions where there's no support for a new faculty member, and they're swimming alone in the ocean. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, that's very true. So Connie, would you like to share with us a bit more about your experience of facilitating intercultural exchange among business students?
Yeah, I only did once, and this is the one.
Oh,
So that
okay.
my undergraduate students work together with postgraduate students. Yeah, so they have different. So just now I remember Cheryl asked what is the major challenge. I think it's the level of knowledge in the subject matter.
Right. So how did you navigate that gap?
So to solve this problem, I assigned a role to them. So they apart from just talking about or learning about their how to complete their assignments, for my undergraduate students, they need to learn about the culture, the cultural differences from the US. And for the US students, they serve as mentor, for my students. Yeah, so I think a specific role for the students team will enhance the effectiveness of virtual exchange. So if not, I don't think the postgraduate students will have motivation to work with undergraduate students.
Right. So then what is the gain for the postgraduate students from the US then?
Yeah, sorry, can you say that again?
Right. So it's obvious our students can benefit from the postgraduates mentorship in the program, right? But what benefit can we bring to the US students through this exchange then?
I think when the lecturer, the US lecturer, convinced the students to engage in this VE, they emphasize that they have a role. The role is the mentor. Yeah, they need to take care of these undergraduate students. So it's like a leader. Yeah, leading the team in the discussion. So
they can learn leadership
too. Yeah, I think that we have a few postgraduate students, so they are leading the discussions. Yeah.
I have to say, I'm getting the hook here that they're telling me time, but I just want to say this is one of the observations I made as well was sometimes just throwing a group of students together where you've got 4th-year students versus 1st-year students, and saying to the 4th-year students, part of your job is to teach those 1st-year students how to the technical side of the project. We actually saw, and that was in fact happened in one of the collaborations, that there was actually a whole new set of learnings there in how both sides actually found it valuable. For some reason, when it's a 20-year-old, 22-year-old teaching a 20-year-old, it's okay, they're not boring. But when a faculty member is doing it, it's like dreadfully boring. So I think that was an interesting learning. So that's an interesting observation, Connie, that you know, I think there is something about when senior students teach junior students, there's a whole different level of engagement and I think appreciation and maybe even learning. I don't know if that's possible, but yeah. I'm sorry to say that we are getting the hook, and the hook being a metaphor for they want me to shut us down. And I really, really do want to thank you guys for a great discussion, great presentations. I actually will look to see if I can find your papers online. And although maybe I should just send you my email and you can send it to me so I don't have to use Google Scholar. But I do appreciate your time and thanks to Hong Kong Baptist University for hosting this conference and for inviting you folks to join us this evening. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Take care. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.